The hidden diary. There are secrets that sleep silently for years, hidden in dusty corners of old houses, waiting for the right moment to come to light. And when they finally emerge, they bring with them the weight of truths that can change everything we thought we knew about those we loved. This is the story of a man who discovered his deceased wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic. A revelation that would transform his grief into something much greater, much more complex than he could ever have imagined. Thomas Anderson was 52 when he lost his wife, Margaret. They had been married for 28 years, built on what he believed to be a solid foundation of trust, complicity, and true love. Margaret died suddenly, the victim of a brain aneurysm that showed no signs, no time, no chance to say goodbye. One day she was there, smiling as she prepared breakfast, and the next, Thomas found himself alone in a house that suddenly seemed too big, too silent, too empty. The first few months were a blur of grief and denial. Thomas moved around the house like a ghost, touching objects Margaret had touched, sitting in the chairs where she used to sit, desperately trying to keep her presence alive through the material things that remained. The house in Greenville, South Carolina, was an 1890s Victorian, with 3 stories, tall windows, and an attic that Margaret always said was full of stored memories. She loved that attic. I went up there often, especially in recent years, and spent hours among the old boxes, wooden trunks, and stacks of photographs yellowed with age. Thomas never paid much attention to it. He was a practical man, a retired engineer, who preferred to spend his time in the garden or in his basement workshop. The attic was Margaret's territory, just as the kitchen was hers, and the workshop was his. They each had their own spaces, their refuges, their own little worlds within the larger world they shared. But now, 6 months after Margaret's death, Thomas found himself climbing the narrow stairs to the attic for the first time in years. Not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. He needed to sort through her things, decide what to keep, what to donate, what to discard. It was part of the grieving process, or so the well-meaning friends trying to help him move on told him. The attic was exactly as Margaret had left it. The dim light streaming through the small windows illuminated the dust, dancing in the air, creating an almost mystical atmosphere, as if the space existed outside of time. Thomas began opening the boxes one by one, finding old dresses, hats Margaret had never worn again, letters from deceased relatives, photo albums that told the story of a shared life. Each object brought a memory, an emotion, a pang of longing that tightened his chest. He didn't know if he was ready for this, but he knew it was necessary. It was as he moved an old cedar chest that something caught his eye. Between the chest and the wall was a narrow, almost imperceptible space, and in that space, wrapped in a faded blue velvet cloth, lay a brown, leather-bound notebook. Thomas picked it up carefully, feeling its weight in his hands. The leather was worn from time and touch, the pages yellowed at the edges. When he opened it, he immediately recognized Margaret's delicate handwriting. It was a diary, and on the first page, written in faded blue ink, was the date, March 15th, 1987, more than 3 decades ago. Thomas's heart began to beat faster. Why would Margaret keep a diary hidden? Why had she never mentioned it in all these years? He flipped through the pages quickly, seeing dates, notes, a few small drawings in the margins. It looked like an ordinary diary, daily accounts, personal reflections. But there was something about the way it was hidden, in that cramped space between the trunk and the wall, that made Thomas uneasy. Margaret was an organized woman. If she kept that diary there hidden, there was a reason. He came down from the attic with the diary in hand, sat in his favorite armchair in the living room, and with trembling fingers began to read. The first few pages were exactly what he expected. Notes about daily life, thoughts about his then-young children, plans for the future, small complaints about domestic problems. But as he progressed, the tone changed. Margaret began writing about deeper feelings, about regrets, about choices made in the past. And then, in an entry dated April 22nd, 1987, Thomas read something that shook his world. "Today, I received a letter from him. After all these years, he still remembers me. I don't know what to do with it. I don't know if I should tell Thomas. Maybe it's best to leave the past where it belongs. Subscribe to the channel. Share this video with your friends. Letters from a lost love." Thomas read that sentence over and over, trying to process what was before his eyes. A letter from him. Who was him? And why would Margaret keep it a secret for so many years? The man who discovered his deceased wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic of the house now found himself faced with a puzzle that challenged everything he thought he knew about his own life. The living room, its walls lined with family photographs, suddenly seemed different, as if the smiling images hid unspoken truths, secrets whispered between the lines of a story he thought he knew by heart. He continued reading, page after page, delving deeper and deeper into Margaret's private world. The diary revealed a woman more complex than he'd imagined, full of doubts, fears and dreams she'd never shared. There were entries about her difficult childhood in Boston, about an absent father and a mother who worked double shifts to support 4 children. Margaret wrote about the loneliness she felt even when surrounded by people, about the feeling of always trying to fill a void she couldn't even fathom. Thomas knew parts of this story, of course, but not with this depth, not with this raw honesty that only emerges when we write for ourselves, without the mask we wear to the world. In a June 1987 entry, Margaret wrote about a recurring dream she had. She was at a train station, suitcase in hand, about to board, but she never made it onto the train. She would stand on the platform, watching other people board, the cars fill, the whistle blow. And when the train finally departed, she would wake with a sense of loss so intense that she would be depressed all day. "It's as if a part of me had been left behind somewhere," she wrote, "as if I had chosen one life when I should have chosen another. But how do I know which was the right choice?" Thomas closed the diary for a moment, pressing his hands to his face. He remembered that time. It was 1987. His oldest son, David, was 7, and his daughter, Emily, was 5. He was just starting his career at the engineering firm, working long hours, traveling frequently. Margaret stayed home with the children, managing the household chores, attending school meetings, organizing birthday parties. She always seemed happy with that life, or at least that's what Thomas believed. Was he so absorbed in his own career that he missed the signs? The moments of melancholy she tried to hide, the times she stared out the window with that distant expression, as if she were somewhere else. The man who discovered his deceased wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic began to question his own memories. Were they trustworthy? Did we only see what we want to see in the people we love? Margaret was his best friend, his companion, the mother of his children. They talked about everything, or so he thought. But now, with that diary in his hands, Thomas realized there was a Margaret he never truly knew. A Margaret who kept secrets, who harbored deep doubts about her choices, who perhaps loved someone before him in a way she never fully got over. He resumed reading, skipping pages until he found more references to the mysterious him. In August 1987, Margaret wrote, "I saw a picture of him in the paper today. He won an award for his work with underprivileged children. I always knew he would do something important. He had that sparkle in his eyes, that certainty of purpose that I never had. Sometimes I wonder what my life would be like if I had made a different choice that summer. But then I look at David and Emily sleeping, and I know I can't regret it. These 2 lives depend on me. I chose to be a mother. I chose to be a wife. And I must honor those choices, even when my heart insists on reminding me of what I left behind." Thomas felt a pang of jealousy mixed with sadness. Who was this man who still occupied a space in Margaret's thoughts even after decades? And what was this choice she mentioned? He continued reading, discovering small fragments of a story Margaret never told. There were mentions of a summer on Cape Cod in 1978 before she met Thomas. She was 22 and working as a counselor at a summer camp. It was there that she met him, whose name Margaret never wrote in full, just the initials, J.M. From what Thomas could piece together from his scattered notes, J.M. was a few years older than Margaret, already a college graduate, working on an education project for underprivileged communities. They fell deeply in love that summer. Margaret described long walks on the beach, conversations that lasted until dawn, the feeling of having found someone who truly understood her. But when the summer ended, J.M. had to travel to Africa for a 2-year humanitarian project. He proposed to Margaret before he left and asked her to come with him, but she refused. She was afraid to leave everything, to go to an unknown place, to abandon her family, who depended on her financially. "It was the hardest decision of my life," Margaret wrote in September 1987. "I loved him, no doubt about that. But love isn't always enough, is it? Sometimes we have to be practical, think about our responsibilities, the people who depend on us. My mother was sick, my younger brothers needed help with college. How could I just leave everything behind? So I let J.M. go alone, and it hurt more than anything I've ever felt. But I thought the pain would pass, that I would move on, meet someone else, be happy." And that's what happened, Thomas thought, with a tightness in his chest. He and Margaret met 2 years after that fateful summer, in 1980, at a party with mutual friends. She was a secretary at a law firm. He was a young engineer full of plans for the future. The attraction was immediate, and 6 months later, they were married. Thomas always thought Margaret loved him as much as he loved her. He never suspected she carried the shadow of a previous love, never mentioned, never forgotten. The man who discovered his deceased wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic now faced an uncomfortable reality. Perhaps he had been her second choice. Perhaps Margaret had grown to love him over time, but never with the intense, absolute way she had loved J.M. This possibility hurt more than Thomas was willing to admit. He had always considered himself a self-assured man, confident in his relationship. But now, alone in that room, with Margaret's diary open on his lap, he felt small, inadequate, as if his entire married life had been built on an unspoken lie. But then something caught her eye. A note from October 1987, where Margaret wrote something different, more hopeful. "Today, Thomas surprised me with flowers, for no reason at all, just because. And I realized that this is love too. Not the stormy, dramatic love I experienced with J.M., but a gentle, constant love that is there every day. Thomas is a good man, a good husband, a wonderful father, and I am lucky to have him. I need to stop looking at the past and learn to appreciate the present, because life happens in the present, not in the memories of what could have been." The woman, he didn't know, Thomas, felt a momentary relief upon reading those words. Margaret loved him, that was clear. Perhaps not in the way he imagined, not with the intensity of her first love with J.M., but with something deeper, more mature. It was a love built day by day, in small kindnesses, in everyday gestures that often go unnoticed. The man who discovered his deceased wife, secret in a diary hidden in the attic, began to understand that perhaps love was not a single, immutable thing, but something that transforms, matures, and takes on new forms over the years. He continued reading, now with less anguish and more curiosity. Subsequent diary entries showed Margaret trying to come to terms with her choices. She wrote about happy times with her family, the children's laughter at breakfast, the nights she and Thomas watched movies together on the couch, the vacations to Florida, where they built sandcastles with David and Emily. There was genuine joy in those pages, but also an underlying melancholy, like a minor note playing in the background of a cheerful melody. Margaret was happy, but there was always a part of her that wondered, what if? In December 1987, she wrote about Christmas. The house was decorated. The tree was covered in ornaments made by the children. The smell of gingerbread cookies was in the air. Thomas had returned from a work trip just on Christmas Eve, bringing gifts for everyone. Margaret described how she felt when she saw him walk through the door with that tired but genuine smile, hugging the children who ran up to him shouting, "Daddy! Daddy!" "I saw in him the man I chose," she wrote, "and for the first time in months, I didn't miss JM. I felt gratitude for Thomas, for this life we've built together, for this family that is real and present, not just a fantasy of what could have been." The following months in the diary showed Margaret increasingly at peace with her life. She wrote less about JM and more about her personal projects. She had returned to painting, something she loved in her youth, but had abandoned after having children. Thomas transformed the small guest room into a studio for her, a birthday surprise. Margaret described this gesture with an emotion that oozed through the pages. "He sees me, really sees me, not just as a mother or a wife, but as Margaret, the woman with dreams of her own. How lucky I was to find someone like that." Thomas remembered that studio. Margaret would spend hours there, creating watercolors of landscapes, portraits, and still lifes. Some of her paintings still decorated the house. He always knew it made her happy, but he had no idea how much it meant to her. The man who discovered his late wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic was learning that sometimes we do the right things for the right reasons without even realizing it. Thomas hadn't turned that room into a studio to compete with JM's memory or to prove his love. He did it because he loved Margaret and wanted to see her happy, and that apparently was enough. The next pages skipped ahead to 1992, 5 years later. There was a blank space, as if Margaret had stopped writing in the diary for a while. When she returned, her tone was different, more mature, more resolved. "I found this diary today at the back of a drawer," she wrote. "I haven't written here in years. Rereading the previous pages, I barely recognized the woman I was. I was so stuck in the past, so obsessed with choices I couldn't change, but life has a funny way of teaching us. I've learned that love isn't just that overwhelming passion I felt for JM. Love is Thomas bringing me coffee in bed on a Sunday morning. It's him listening patiently while I complain about the plumbing problem. It's the way he looks at me after all these years, as if he still finds me interesting." Thomas had to pause, his eyes welling up. He remembered those Sundays, the ritual of making coffee and bringing it to Margaret in bed, sitting beside her, talking about nothing and everything at once. They were simple moments, unglamorous, undramatic, but they were genuine, and apparently they meant as much to her as they did to him. The man who discovered his deceased wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic was rediscovering the love he once had. But through Margaret's eyes, through her private words, her unfiltered truth. Margaret continued in that 1992 entry. "I heard from a mutual acquaintance that JM got married last year. I felt a pang, I won't lie. But it wasn't jealousy or regret. It was more like the closing of a chapter that should have been closed long ago. He moved on, built his life, found his love. And so did I. The difference is that I was stuck in a romanticized version of the past, while real life, the good life, was happening right in front of me. I won't write about JM anymore. I won't entertain ghosts anymore. My present is with Thomas, with our children, with the life we chose together. And that choice, I finally realized, was the right one." Thomas felt a weight lifted from his shoulders. Margaret chose to stay, not out of obligation, not for lack of options, but because she had genuinely built a life she valued. He turned a few more pages, finding sporadic entries over the years. In 1998, Margaret wrote about David's wedding, about the excitement of seeing her son build his own family. In 2003, about the birth of her first grandson, a boy named Thomas after his grandfather. Margaret described the joy of holding that small child in her arms, of seeing the continuity of life through the generations. There were also difficult moments recorded. In 2005, Margaret wrote about her mother's death, the pain of loss, and the comfort she found in Thomas, who stood by her side throughout the funeral, holding her hand, being her anchor. "I don't know what I would do without him," she wrote. "When my mother passed, I felt like a part of me was gone. But Thomas was there, steadfast as ever, reminding me that I still have a family, that I still have reasons to carry on. That's love. Not the grand romantic declarations, but the constant presence, the shoulder to cry on, the hand that never lets go." The man who discovered his deceased wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic continued reading, now with a nostalgic smile on his face. There were entries about trips they took together after their children left home. Margaret described a trip to Italy in 2010, how they felt free and young again, exploring the streets of Rome hand in hand, tasting wine in Tuscany, watching the sunset in Venice. "I looked at Thomas today over dinner in a small restaurant in Florence," she wrote. "The candles illuminated his face, highlighting the wrinkles around his eyes, the grey in his hair. And I thought, this is the man I grow old with. This is the man who knows all my stories, all my fears, all my dreams, and I wouldn't trade it for anything." The last diary entries were more recent, from 2023 and 2024. Margaret wrote about Thomas's retirement, about how good it was to have him home more, even if he was stubborn and tried to rearrange the kitchen to his liking. She wrote about family gatherings, grandchildren growing up, the feeling of a full life. But there was also a note of melancholy in the final pages. Margaret mentioned frequent fatigue, headaches that came and went. She attributed these to age, stress, sinus problems. She never imagined they were signs of something more serious. The last diary entry was from 3 weeks before Margaret passed away. "I woke up today feeling something was different," she wrote. "I can't explain it, but there's a sense of finality in the air, as if a cycle were coming to a close. I looked at Thomas sleeping beside me this morning and felt an immense gratitude. Gratitude for this life, for this love, for all the choices that brought me here. If I could go back in time, I wouldn't change a thing. Because everything has led me to this moment, to this man, to this family, and that is more than enough. It is everything." Searching for Jonathan Mitchell. Thomas closed the diary with trembling hands, tears streaming freely down his face. Margaret knew. Somehow, on some subconscious level, she knew the end was near. And her last written words were of gratitude, of acceptance, of peace with the life they had lived together. The man who discovered his deceased wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic of the house realized that the secret was not a betrayal, not a lie. It was simply the journey of a woman trying to reconcile her past with her present, her fantasies with her reality, her what-ifs with her "it's just the way it is." But there were still unanswered questions. Who was J.M.? Where was he now? Margaret said he'd married in 1991, but what had happened since? Did he know the impact he'd had on her life? Did he also cherish memories of that summer on Cape Cod? Thomas didn't know why these questions mattered, but they did. Maybe because understanding J.M. would help him understand Margaret better. Or maybe because, in some strange way, Thomas felt he owed something to this man who had loved Margaret first, who had made her feel intense feelings, who had left a lasting mark on her soul. He returned to the attic, determined to find more information. If Margaret had hidden the diary, perhaps there were other things hidden there as well. He began rummaging through the boxes more carefully now, searching for something he wasn't sure what it was. He found unfamiliar photo albums, old letters, postcards. And then, at the bottom of a box labeled College Memories, he found a yellowed envelope postmarked September 1978. The envelope was addressed to Margaret at her old address in Boston. The return address had only the initials, J.M., followed by an address on Cape Cod. The man who discovered his deceased wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic of the house carefully opened the envelope, removing several sheets of thin paper covered in elegant, masculine handwriting. It was a letter from J.M. to Margaret, written shortly after the end of that fateful summer. Thomas began reading, feeling like an intruder, but unable to stop. "Dear Margaret," the letter began, "I am writing this letter from the airport, waiting for my flight to Nairobi. My heart is heavy, but also full of hope. I know you said no, I know your reasons are valid, and I must respect your decision. But I cannot leave without telling you once again, you are the most extraordinary person I have ever met. This summer, you showed me what it means to truly connect with someone." The letter continued for several pages, with J.M. describing his plans for Africa, the work he would do there, the challenges he expected to face. But always returning to Margaret, expressing his hope that she would change her mind, that she would find a way to join him. "The door will always be open," he wrote. "No matter how much time passes, no matter where I am, if you decide to reach out, I will be waiting. Because what we feel is not ordinary, Margaret. It is rare, precious, and worth fighting for." The letter ended with a Nairobi address and a contact number, along with the words, "I love you today. I will love you tomorrow. I will love you always. Yours, J.M." Thomas found other letters in the same envelope. J.M. wrote to Margaret regularly in the early months. Letters from Africa, describing life there, the children he was helping, the communities he was trying to transform, but also letters of longing, of unrequited love, of hope gradually fading. The last letter was dated March 1979, 6 months after the first. "Margaret," it said simply, "I haven't had a reply to any of my letters. I understand the message. You've moved on, and I need to do the same. This will be my last letter. I want you to know that I hold no grudges, no anger, only sadness for what could have been, but also gratitude for what was. You gave me the happiest summer of my life, and that's more than many people have. Be happy, Margaret. You deserve all the happiness in the world. Goodbye, my love, J.M." The man who discovered his deceased wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic felt an unexpected empathy for J.M. He, too, had loved Margaret and felt the pain of loss, albeit of a different kind. Thomas lost Margaret to death, but J.M. lost her while she was still alive, which was perhaps equally painful. There was a dignity in those letters, a graceful acceptance of rejection that Thomas admired. J.M. didn't beg, didn't become bitter. He simply said goodbye and moved on. But Thomas still needed to know more. He returned to his diary, searching for clues to J.M.'s full identity, and then, in an entry he had previously overlooked, he found it. Margaret had written, "I saw a story about Jonathan Mitchell's work in a magazine today. He's doing amazing things in refugee education. I always knew he would change the world." Jonathan Mitchell. Finally, Thomas had a full name, and with a name he could find answers. He went downstairs to his office and turned on his computer. Searching for Jonathan Mitchell brought up several results, but one in particular caught his eye. A 2015 Boston newspaper article about an award-winning educator who founded a non-profit focused on education for children in conflict zones. The article's photo showed a grey-haired man with a gentle face, eyes that seemed to carry stories of faraway places and touched lives. It was him. It had to be him. The age matched, the history of working in Africa. It all made sense. Thomas continued researching, discovering more about Jonathan Mitchell's life. He did indeed marry in 1991 to a woman named Sarah, also an educator. They had 2 children. They lived in several countries over the years, often working on humanitarian projects. In 2018, Jonathan published a memoir about his experiences, titled Frontiers of the Heart, A Life Dedicated to Education. Thomas found the book available online and, without much thought, purchased the digital version. Perhaps there he would find more answers, more pieces of the puzzle that was Margaret's secret life. He spent the night reading the book. Jonathan wrote eloquently about his journey, the places he visited, the people he met, the challenges he faced. There were chapters on his years in Africa, the Middle East and Southeast Asia. But it was in the 3rd chapter, titled The Summer That Changed Everything, that Thomas found what he was looking for. Jonathan described the summer of 1978 on Cape Cod, his work at the camp, and how he met a young counselor named M. He didn't use her full name, respecting her privacy, but it was clearly Margaret. "I met M on a rainy June morning," Jonathan wrote. "She was trying to set up a tent for the kids, battling the wind and rain, but laughing at the absurdity of the situation. I offered to help, and that simple interaction turned into the deepest connection I've ever experienced. We spent the entire summer together, talking about everything from philosophy to our wildest dreams. She made me want to be better, to do more, to achieve beyond what I thought possible. When the summer ended and I asked her to come with me to Africa, I truly believed she would say yes, but she had her own responsibilities, her own life, and I had to learn to respect that, even though my heart was breaking." The man who discovered his deceased wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic continued reading, discovering that Jonathan had carried Margaret in his heart for years, just as she had carried him. But eventually he found Sarah, fell in love again, and built a family. "I have learned that the human heart has an extraordinary capacity," Jonathan wrote. "We can love more than one person in a lifetime, in different but equally true ways. M was my first true love, and that summer shaped who I have become. But Sarah is my ultimate love, my partner, my home. I didn't need to forget M to love Sarah. I just needed to understand that love is not a limited resource. It expands, transforms, finds new paths." Thomas closed the book, feeling a strange peace settle over him. Jonathan Mitchell wasn't a villain, he wasn't a phantom threat. He was just another human being trying to navigate the complexities of love and choices. The inevitable encounter. Thomas spent the next few days obsessed with Jonathan Mitchell. It wasn't jealousy exactly, at least not the kind he'd expected to feel. It was something more complex, a mixture of curiosity, respect, and an inexplicable need to know the man who had divided Margaret's heart in ways he'd never known. The man who discovered his late wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic now faced a difficult decision. Leave the past where it belongs, or seek closure that perhaps didn't even need to exist. He discovered through Jonathan's organization's website that Jonathan now lived in Portland, Oregon, retired from fieldwork, but still active as a consultant and speaker. There was an email address for professional contact. Thomas spent hours staring at that email, typing and deleting messages, trying to find the right words. What to say? "Hello, I'm the husband of the woman you loved 40 years ago and who never forgot you." It sounded absurd, intrusive, perhaps even cruel. But the need to understand, to connect the dots, to honor Margaret's complete memory, was stronger than his hesitation. Finally, after 3 days of discarded drafts, Thomas wrote a simple, direct message. "Mr. Mitchell, my name is Thomas Anderson. I am the widower of Margaret Anderson, whom I believe you met on Cape Cod in the summer of 1978. I recently came across some of her personal writings and would like to talk to you about that period, if you are willing. I understand this request may seem strange, but it would mean a lot to me. Sincerely, Thomas." He hit send before he could change his mind, and then waited. The reply arrived the next day, faster than Thomas expected. "Thomas," Jonathan wrote, using only his first name, already establishing a gentle informality. "I was deeply saddened to hear of Margaret's passing. She was an extraordinary person, and I'm sure her loss leaves a huge void. I would be honored to speak with you. I'll be in Boston next week for a lecture at the university. If you can make it, we can meet. I've left my phone number below in case you'd prefer to talk first. With sincere sympathy, Jonathan Mitchell." The man who discovered his deceased wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic stared at the message for long minutes. This was really happening. He was going to meet Jonathan Mitchell, the man Margaret loved before him, the man whose letters she had kept for decades, the man who had occupied a permanent place in her thoughts, even after she had built a life with Thomas. The idea was both terrifying and necessary. Thomas responded, confirming the meeting, arranging for a Thursday afternoon at a quiet cafe in downtown Boston. The week passed in a blur of anxiety and preparation. Thomas told his children about the diary, about Jonathan Mitchell, about the planned meeting. David, ever practical, thought it unnecessary. "Dad, why bring up the past? Mom loved you, you know that, the rest doesn't matter." But Emily, more sensitive, understood. "Dad needs answers," she told her brother, "not about whether Mom loved him, but about who she really was. It's a gift, really. How many people get the chance to know their loved ones more fully, even after they're gone?" On Thursday, Thomas drove to Boston, his heart pounding as he approached the cafe. He arrived 15 minutes early, ordered a barely touched coffee, and stared out the window, watching people pass by on the street. And then he saw him. Jonathan Mitchell walked into the cafe exactly at the appointed time, and Thomas recognized him immediately from the online photos. He was tall, thin, with hair that was completely white now, but still thick. He wore wire-framed glasses and had the erect posture of someone who has spent his life working with purpose. His eyes scanned the cafe until they found Thomas, and there was a moment of mutual recognition. Two men connected by a woman they both loved. "Thomas?" Jonathan held out his hand and Thomas shook it, noticing the firm but gentle grip. "Jonathan, thank you for coming." They sat down, and for a moment neither of them knew where to begin. It was Jonathan who broke the silence. "I have to say I was surprised by your email, but also relieved in a way. Margaret was an important part of my life, and I never had the chance to, I don't know, properly honor that. When I read your book, when I wrote about that summer, I left out a lot. Some things are too private to share with the world." The man who discovered his dead wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic looked at Jonathan, seeing not a rival but a companion in loss. "I found her diary," Thomas explained, "and her letters. She never told me about you, about that summer. I spent 28 years with her thinking I knew her whole story. And then, 6 months after she leaves, I discover there was a whole part of her I never knew about." His voice trembled slightly, and Jonathan nodded sympathetically. "Margaret was a deep person," Jonathan said softly. "She felt things intensely, but she also had this need to protect the people she loved. I'm not surprised she didn't tell you about our past, not because it was shameful, but because she probably knew it could hurt you unnecessarily. She loved you, Thomas. I'm sure of that, even without knowing you together, because Margaret wouldn't make choices lightly. If she chose to build a life with you, it was because she saw something special, something worth having." Thomas felt his eyes well up. "But she loved you too, deeply. And part of me wonders, was I just the second option, the safe haven after you left? Would she have stayed with me if you had?" Jonathan sighed, taking off his glasses and wiping them with a tissue, a gesture Thomas realized was done more to buy himself time to think than out of necessity. "That's a question that doesn't have a fair answer," Jonathan finally said. But I'll tell you something I've learned throughout my life, working in so many places, experiencing so many different cultures. Love isn't a competition. It's not about who loved more or who came first. It's about moments, connections, choices made under specific circumstances. He leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Margaret and I loved each other that summer of 1978. It was real, it was intense, it was transformative for both of us. But we were at a specific point in our lives, in a specific place, with specific dreams. When the summer ended and reality hit, our lives were heading in different directions. She had responsibilities, fears, valid reasons not to come with me. And I had a mission, a calling that I couldn't ignore. Our love was true, but it wasn't sustainable in that context. The man who discovered his deceased wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic of the house listened intently. Each word, Jonathan said, bringing a new level of understanding. You and Margaret, Jonathan continued, built something different. You had time, you had children, you had a shared daily life. That's a kind of love Margaret and I never had the chance to have. It's easy to romanticize a summer love, a love that existed in a perfect bubble of time and space. But real love, the love that lasts decades, that survives bills, illnesses, crises, mundane moments, that is the deepest love. And that was the love Margaret had with you. Thomas felt something loosen inside his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he was carrying. Thank you for saying that, he murmured. I needed to hear it. Jonathan smiled, a sad but genuine smile. You know, Thomas, for years I wondered what if. What if Margaret had come with me? What if we had built a life together? But then I met Sarah, my wife, and I realized that what if is a prison. Margaret taught me so much that summer, helped me grow, gave me memories I cherish. But Sarah gave me a life, and that makes all the difference. The two men talked for over 2 hours, sharing stories about Margaret from completely different perspectives. Jonathan spoke of the 22-year-old he knew, full of dreams, but also insecurities, struggling to find her place in the world. Thomas spoke of the mature woman she became, the devoted mother, the supportive wife, the talented artist, the hidden truth. As the conversation stretched into their third cup of coffee, Jonathan looked at Thomas with an expression that mixed hesitation and determination. There's something I need to tell you, he said, his voice dropping. Something Margaret may never have mentioned, not even in her diary. The man who discovered his dead wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic felt his stomach tighten. Was there more? After everything he had already discovered, were there still secrets hidden? Jonathan took a deep breath before continuing. In the fall of 1979, almost a year after we separated, Margaret wrote to me. It was the only time she responded to my letters. I was in Nairobi, just beginning to accept that she had moved on. And then that letter arrived. He paused, his eyes distant, as if reliving that moment. She told me she was engaged. To you, Thomas. She said she had met a good man, an engineer with solid plans for the future, someone who made her feel secure. But she also said that before getting married, she needed to know if there was still a chance for us. Thomas felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. What? Jonathan nodded slowly. Margaret asked me if I still wanted her, if there was still room for her in my life in Africa. She said if I said yes, she would break off the engagement and come find me. But if I said no, she would move on and marry you, and we would never be in touch again. The man who had discovered his dead wife, his secret in a diary hidden in the attic of their house, could barely process what he was hearing. Had Margaret considered leaving him, even before they were married? What did you say? Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jonathan smiled sadly. I said no. The silence that followed was loaded with meaning. Not because I didn't love her, Jonathan continued quickly, but because I realized she was asking me to make the decision for her, and that wasn't fair to either of us. If Margaret came to Africa because I said yes, she would always wonder if she made the right choice. If she stayed with you because I said no, she would always have that answer as an excuse not to follow her own heart. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on some distant point. I wrote to her saying that the decision had to be hers, and hers alone. I told her that I loved her, always would, but that she needed to choose the life she truly wanted, not the life I validated. I told her that if she chose you, she should do it wholeheartedly, without reservation, without looking back, and if she chose me, it should be for the same reason. He turned his gaze to Thomas. 3 weeks later, I received a wedding card. You and Margaret were married. The man who discovered his deceased wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Anger that he had never known, relief that Margaret had chosen to stay, sadness that she had carried that doubt all the way to the altar. She never mentioned it, Thomas said, his voice breaking. Not a word. Jonathan nodded understandingly. She shouldn't have, because from the moment she chose you, that was the only reality that mattered. Looking back would be dishonest to the choice she made. But there was something that didn't make sense to Thomas. If she had doubts, why get married? Why not wait until she was sure? Jonathan smiled, and this time there was genuine warmth in his expression. Because Margaret understood something that many of us take a lifetime to learn. Absolute certainty doesn't exist. Every important choice in life involves a leap of faith, a bet on a future we can't predict. Margaret took a chance on you, Thomas. And from what you've told me about the 28 years you spent together, it was the right one. Thomas wanted to believe it, but doubt gnawed at him. How do you know? How can you be sure she hasn't spent all these years regretting it, wishing she'd made a different choice? Jonathan leaned forward again, his gaze intense and sincere. Because Margaret wrote to me again many years later. It was in 2005, shortly after my book was published. She'd seen a review in a magazine and decided to get in touch. Thomas felt his heart race. Margaret had contacted Jonathan in 2005. That wasn't in the diary. It was just a quick email, Jonathan continued. She congratulated me on the book, said she was happy to hear I'd found my way, built a family, made a difference in the world. And then she wrote something I've never forgotten. He took his phone out of his pocket, opened his email folder, and searched for a moment before finding what he was looking for. Here it is, she said. Jonathan, for years I've wondered if I made the right choice that fall of 1979. But today, as I watched my husband play with our grandchildren in the garden, I realized it wasn't about choosing the right man or the right life. It was about choosing and then making that choice the right one. Thomas gave me a wonderful life, not because he was perfect, but because we chose, every day, to build something together. That's love, not fate, not overwhelming passion, but the constant choice to stay, to grow, to love even when it's hard. The man who discovered his deceased wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic felt the tears flowing freely now. Those words from Margaret, written for Jonathan but about Thomas, were the most precious gift he could receive. She never told me she contacted you, Thomas said softly. Jonathan smiled. She didn't need to tell me. It wasn't about the two of us. It was about the peace she finally found with her own choices. Margaret was telling you, through me, that you were the right choice. Not because I said no, not because circumstances forced her, but because she chose to make you the right choice. They were silent for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts. It was Thomas who finally spoke. Thank you for telling me this. I know I didn't have to share something so personal. Jonathan nodded. Margaret was too important to me to let you carry unnecessary doubts. She loved you, Thomas, completely and genuinely. The fact that she loved me first doesn't diminish the love she felt for you in the slightest." Thomas wiped his eyes, trying to regain his composure. "Can I ask you a personal question?" Jonathan nodded. "Do you still love her? After all these years, after you've built your own family, do you still carry Margaret in your heart?" Jonathan considered the question carefully before answering. "Yes and no. I love her memory. I love what we shared. I love the person she helped me become. But I'm not in love with her, if that's what you're asking. That ended a long time ago. What I have now is gratitude and affection for someone who was important in my journey." The man who discovered his deceased wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic finally understood. Love is not a static thing, frozen in time. It changes, evolves, transforms. Margaret loved Jonathan one way that summer. She loved Thomas another way for nearly 3 decades. And both loves were valid, both were real, both mattered. There was no competition, no winner or loser. There were just different chapters of a life lived fully. "There's one more thing I need to show you," Jonathan said, reaching into his backpack and pulling out an envelope. "When Margaret sent me that email in 2005, I replied, and she mailed me something a few weeks later." He handed the envelope to Thomas. "This is yours now. I think she'd want you to have it." Thomas opened the envelope with trembling hands and found a photograph. It was of Margaret, still young, sitting on a beach he recognized as Cape Cod. She was smiling, the wind ruffling her hair, her eyes shining with that special light she possessed. On the back of the photo, in Margaret's handwriting, was written, "To Jonathan, the summer that taught me to love. To Thomas, the life that taught me what love is. You both made me who I am. Eternally grateful, Margaret." Thomas clutched the photograph to his chest, the sobs finally breaking free. Jonathan placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, letting him cry unhurriedly, without judgment. When Thomas finally regained his composure, he looked at Jonathan with profound gratitude. "You gave me back my wife," he said. "The whole Margaret, not just the part I knew. I can't thank you enough." Jonathan smiled, and there were tears in his eyes too. "Thank you for allowing me to honor her memory in this way. Margaret was a special person, and she deserves to be remembered in all her complexity and beauty. What Margaret never told you." The two men said goodbye outside the cafe, with a hug that held decades of unshared but now connected history. Thomas drove back to Greenville with a clearer mind, feeling as if he had finally found the answers he was looking for. The man who discovered his deceased wife, secret in a diary hidden in the attic of their house, thought he now knew the whole story. But fate, as always, had one more surprise in store. 3 days after meeting Jonathan, Thomas received a call from Emily. His daughter had come over to help him organize some of Margaret's things, specifically the clothes that still filled the closet. "Dad, I found something strange," she said, her voice carrying a note of confusion. "There's a safe hidden in the back of Mum's closet, behind the shoes. It has a combination lock. Do you know the combination?" Thomas frowned. He hadn't known there was a safe in Margaret's closet. When he got home, Emily was sitting on the bedroom floor, the small grey metal box beside her. It was discreet, the size of a shoebox with a 4-digit combination lock. Thomas picked up the box, examining it. Why would Margaret have something locked so carefully? The diary had been enough of a revelation. What else could there be? "Try her birthday," Emily suggested. Thomas typed in 06-15, June 15th. Nothing. "And your wedding date?" 11/08, November 8th. The lock didn't budge. Thomas tried several other combinations. His children's birth dates, old addresses, significant numbers. Nothing worked. He was about to give up when a sudden thought occurred to him. the summer of 1978, Cape Cod. He typed 0778, July 1978, the month Margaret and Jonathan met. The lock clicked and opened. The man who discovered his deceased wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic felt his heart sink. If the combination was that date, the contents of the box certainly had something to do with Jonathan Mitchell. But when he opened the box, what he found made no sense. There were legal documents, certificates, official papers with stamps and signatures. Thomas picked up the first document, his eyes scanning the formal legal words. It was a birth certificate for a child named Daniel James Morrison, born on March 15, 1979, in Portland, Maine. The mother listed was Margaret Ellen Carson, Margaret's maiden name. The father was listed as unknown. Thomas looked at Emily, who had paled. "Dad, does that mean—" Thomas couldn't form words. His fingers trembled as he picked up another document. It was an adoption document, dated May 1979, transferring custody of Daniel James Morrison to a Morrison family in Portland. Margaret had signed the document, relinquishing all parental rights. There were also photographs, a newborn baby wrapped in a blue blanket, a young, visibly thinner Margaret holding the baby with an expression that mixed love and indescribable pain, and a letter carefully folded in an envelope that was never mailed. The man who discovered his deceased wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic of the house opened the letter with hands barely able to hold the paper. It was addressed to "My son Daniel," written in Margaret's handwriting, but visibly trembling, as if each word took an eternity to compose. Thomas began reading aloud to Emily, who had sat up in bed, her hands covering her mouth in shock. "My dear Daniel, I write this letter knowing you'll probably never read it. Tomorrow, I'm going to give you to a family that can give you everything I can't: stability, resources, 2 parents, a real home. I'm only 22, I have no money, I have no support. My father died when I was 15, my mother can barely support herself and my younger siblings. I'm alone in this, and you deserve more than a desperate single mother can offer in 1979. Thomas paused, his voice breaking. Emily stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. He continued, "Your father doesn't know you exist. He was in Africa when I found out I was pregnant. I considered telling him, but what right did I have? He had followed his calling, his purpose. I was the one who made the choice not to go with him. And then you happened, my consequence, my gift, my torment. I carried you alone for 9 months, hid my pregnancy by wearing baggy clothes, pretended everything was fine. When you were born, I held you in my arms and knew I had to let you go, because loving you meant wanting the best for you, even if that best didn't include me." The revelation fell upon Thomas like an avalanche. Margaret had borne Jonathan Mitchell a son she gave up for adoption, a son who existed before Thomas entered her life, and she had never, in nearly 30 years of marriage, mentioned it. The man who discovered his deceased wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic realized that the secret wasn't just about a past love. It was about a loss Margaret had carried alone, in silence, her entire life. Emily was crying openly now. "Dad, does this mean I have an older brother? That David has a brother? That Mom had a child before us and never told us?" Thomas had no answers. He continued reading the letter, each word cutting deeper. "2 months after you were born, I met a man named Thomas. He's kind, stable, has a good job. He's wooing me with flowers and dinners. He sees something in me that I don't see in myself, and I'm considering saying yes when he proposes. But how can I start a life with him without telling him about you? How can I build a future around this secret? I've decided I can't. The secret would stain you, stain our family, stain everything. So I'll keep you here, in this box, in these documents, in these few photos, and I'll move on. I'll love Thomas, I'll have more children, I'll build a life. But a part of me will always be in that hospital in Portland, holding you for the last time before handing you over to the social worker. A part of me will always be broken. I love you, my son. Even if you never know I existed, even if I can never be in your life, I love you with every cell in my body, with every beat of my heart. And I hope, wherever you are, that you are happy. Your birth mother, Margaret. Thomas folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the envelope. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Emily's suppressed sobs. Finally, she spoke, her voice small and broken. Why didn't she ever tell us? Why did she carry this alone? Thomas shook his head, trying to process decades of secrets unraveled in a matter of days. It was 1979, he said slowly. Single mothers were stigmatized, judged. Margaret probably felt shame, fear, and the longer she didn't tell, the more impossible it became to reveal. The man who discovered his deceased wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic of the house looked at the documents scattered around him. Birth certificates, adoption papers, photographs of a baby who grew up without ever knowing his biological mother. And then something struck him like a lightning bolt. "Jonathan," he said suddenly. "Jonathan doesn't know. She never told him. He has a biological son in the world and has no idea." Emily looked at her father with wide eyes. "Are you going to tell him?" Thomas didn't know. Should he? Did he have the right to reveal a secret Margaret took to her grave? But then he thought about Daniel. Where was he now? He would be 46. Would he be married? Would he have children? Would he know he was adopted? Would he be searching for his biological roots? In recent years, with DNA testing and genealogical websites, many adoptees had found their biological families. Could Daniel be searching for Margaret, unaware that she had passed away? Thomas's head was spinning with possibilities and unanswered questions. Emily picked up one of the last papers in the box. It was a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, from 2010. It was a short article about open versus closed adoptions, with a quote from someone named Daniel Morrison, an adoptee rights activist in Oregon. "Dad," Emily said, her voice shaking, I think we can find him." Choices and destinations. Thomas spent the night awake, staring at the ceiling of the room he had shared with Margaret for so many years. Emily had spent the night researching. She found Daniel Morrison easily. He was relatively well known in adoption rights circles, had a professional website and social media profiles. The photos showed a 46-year-old man with graying brown hair and eyes. Thomas recognized immediately. They were Margaret E.'s. The same amber color, the same slightly almond shape, the same gleam of intelligence. Daniel was married to a woman named Rebecca. They had 3 children. He worked as an attorney, specializing in family and adoption law, dedicating his career to helping other adoptees find their birth families. "The irony is cruel," Thomas told Emily the next morning as they drank coffee together in the kitchen. "Dad, I think we need to tell him. Not just him, but Jonathan too. They have a right to know." Thomas knew she was right, but the weight of responsibility was crushing. The man who discovered his dead wife, secret in a diary, hidden in the attic, decided that the truth, no matter how painful, was always preferable to a comfortable lie. He called Jonathan first, requesting another urgent meeting. When they met again, this time at Thomas's house in Greenville, Jonathan could tell immediately by his expression that something serious had happened. Thomas handed over the safe deposit box, the documents, the photographs, and he watched as Jonathan processed the knowledge that he had a biological son he never knew existed. The color drained from Jonathan's face. He held the baby's photo with trembling hands, his eyes scanning every detail of the small face. "I have a son," he whispered, more to himself than to Thomas. "All these years, I've had a son and never known." Anger came first. How could she not tell me? I had a right to know. I could have helped. I could have come back. I could have... But then the anger dissolved into deep sadness. Jonathan sat heavily on the sofa, the photograph still in his hands. "She was alone," he said finally, his voice breaking. "Pregnant, alone, scared, in 1979. And I was on the other side of the world, living my dream, with no idea what I had left behind." Emily, who had been watching from the doorway, came in and showed Jonathan the information she had found about Daniel. Photos of his family, his career, his life. Jonathan looked at each image with a mixture of admiration and pain. "He's handsome," Jonathan said softly. "He seems to have built a good life, a family. He's a good man." Thomas nodded. "Margaret gave him this chance. She gave him to a family who could offer what she couldn't. It was an act of love, Jonathan. Painful, but love." The big question now was, should they contact Daniel? Jonathan and Thomas spent hours debating, weighing the pros and cons. Daniel had a family, an established life. Learning that his biological mother had passed away could be devastating. But he was also an adoptee rights attorney. He, more than anyone, would understand the importance of knowing his origins. Finally, they decided to write a letter. Not a direct, abrupt approach, but a gentle letter explaining the situation, leaving the choice of whether or not to respond in Daniel's hands. "Dear Mr. Morrison, we are writing to share information about your biological origins. Your biological mother, Margaret Ellen Carson Anderson, passed away in March 2024. Before her death, she carefully preserved all records of your birth and adoption, along with a letter expressing her love for you and explaining the difficult circumstances that led to her decision. Your biological father, Jonathan Mitchell, was unaware of your existence until recently. We would both like to share this information with you if you are willing. However, we will completely respect your decision to respond or not. With sincere regards, Thomas Anderson and Jonathan Mitchell." They sent the letter certified mail to Daniel's business address, and then they waited. A week passed, then 2. Thomas began to think Daniel had decided not to respond, which was his right. But then, 18 days after they sent the letter, Thomas's phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number in Oregon. He answered with his heart racing. "Hello?" A deep, slightly choked male voice answered. "Mr. Anderson? This is Daniel Morrison. I received your letter." The man who discovered his deceased wife is secret in a diary hidden in the attic felt tears well up immediately. "Daniel, thank you for calling." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Daniel spoke. "I've spent my whole life wondering about her, why she gave me up for adoption, if she thought of me, if she regretted it. And now I know she loved me. The letter you sent, the one she wrote to me, it changed everything." His voice broke. "She's gone, and I'll never have the chance to know her. But at least now I know I was loved, that I was wanted, that she made the hardest decision of her life because she wanted the best for me." Thomas arranged a meeting for the following week. Daniel flew to Greenville, bringing Rebecca and their 3 children. Jonathan also came from Portland. When Daniel first entered Thomas's house, there was a moment of absolute silence as everyone processed the moment. And then Daniel looked at Jonathan, seeing for the first time the man who was his biological father. They studied each other, noticing similarities, the same height, the same build, the same way they tilted their heads when they were thinking. "Hi," Daniel said simply, extending his hand. Jonathan shook it, but then pulled Daniel into a hug. "Hi, son," he whispered, and they both cried. Thomas watched with Emily and David, who had come as soon as he heard the news. He was seeing a family forming before his eyes, not by blood, but by choice. Daniel had adoptive parents who raised and loved him, and he made it clear nothing would change that. But now he also had biological connections, origin stories, answers to lifelong questions. They spent the weekend together, sharing stories about Margaret. Thomas showed Daniel her painting studio, the watercolors that decorated the house, the garden she loved so much. Jonathan told him about the summer of 1978, about the brilliant and complex young woman he knew. Emily and David shared memories of the wonderful mother they had, kind yet firm, creative yet practical. And Daniel absorbed it all, piecing together a puzzle of the woman who gave him life, but could never be in his. On their last day, they went together to the cemetery where Margaret was buried. Daniel placed flowers on the grave and stood there for long minutes in silence. When he finally spoke, his words were to Margaret. "Thank you for giving me a chance at life, for loving me enough to let me go, for carrying this burden alone so I could have a happy childhood free from guilt and complications. I hope that wherever you are, you find peace, because I've had a good life. I have a wonderful family, and that was possible because of your impossible choice." The man who discovered his deceased wife's secret in a diary hidden in the attic stood beside Jonathan and Daniel, 3 generations connected by the love of an extraordinary woman. Thomas realized that Margaret was not perfect, but her imperfection made her more human, more real, more worthy of love. She made mistakes, kept secrets, made decisions she perhaps should have made differently. But he also loved deeply, sacrificed enormously, and lived with the integrity he could muster under impossible circumstances. When Daniel and his family left, promising to stay in touch and visit regularly, Thomas returned home, feeling something he hadn't felt in months: completeness. Not because all his questions were answered, but because he finally accepted that some questions don't have perfect answers. Life is complicated, love is complex, and the people we love are multifaceted in ways we'll never fully understand. And that's okay, because love doesn't require perfection. It requires acceptance, understanding, and the courage to embrace the full humanity of the one we love. Thomas climbed into the attic one last time, looking down at the space where it all began. The cedar chest was still there, the narrow space where the diary had been hidden now empty. But the attic no longer felt like a place of secrets and shadows. It felt like a place of memories, of stories, of a life lived fully, with all its joys and pains. He smiled, whispering to the sky, "Thank you, Margaret, for everything, for the years we had, for the lessons you left, for the family we built, and for loving me enough to be human, imperfect, real." What about you? If you found a diary from someone you loved, revealing secrets kept for decades, would you choose to read it or leave the past where it belongs? How would you deal with truths that change everything you thought you knew? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends, because stories like this remind us that life is more complex and more beautiful than we imagine, and that love, in all its imperfect forms, is what makes it all worthwhile.